There is a man, I will not use his real name, so let's call him Robert, who retired 6 years ago with a net worth somewhere north of $2 million. Robert drives a car that is 9 years old, nothing remarkable about it. 4 doors, a scratch on the rear bumper he never fixed. His neighbor, a man who works in finance, once leaned over the fence and asked Robert if everything was okay. Robert said yes, everything was fine. The neighbor looked at the car again, nodded, and walked back inside. What the neighbor does not know, what almost nobody looking at Robert from the outside would figure out, is that Robert is one of the most financially secure people on his street, probably in his zip code. And the car is 9 years old, not because Robert cannot afford a new one. It is 9 years old because Robert decided it should stay 9 years old. That distinction matters more than almost anything else you will hear today. There is a pattern that shows up consistently when you spend enough time around people who actually retire with money. Not people who perform wealth. Not people who look comfortable from the outside while quietly carrying the financial structure of someone who is one bad year away from a serious problem. But people who arrive at retirement with genuine options. People for whom retirement is a choice rather than a collapse into necessity. When you study those people, when you pay attention to what they actually do rather than what they say, certain habits start appearing over and over again. And almost all of them look strange to the people around them. They look unnecessary. They look eccentric. They look, frankly, like something might be wrong. Nothing is wrong. In fact, these habits are precisely what produced the outcome. Here's the first one, and it is the one that makes people most uncomfortable when it gets described plainly. The people who retire rich almost universally stop sharing financial details with the people closest to them. Family, old friends, people they have known for decades. Not because they become secretive or cold, but because they notice something early in the process that most people never notice at all. Think about what happens when someone shares a financial win, a raise, a good investment, a year where things went better than expected. The energy in the relationships around that person shifts. It is subtle. It does not announce itself, but it is there. A comment that carries a small expectation. A request that would not have been made the week before. A repositioning of what people believe they can reasonably ask for. And the reverse is also true. Share a financial worry, and a different but equally costly shift happens. Advice arrives that was not requested. Suggestions about what you should do with your money come from people who have no particular expertise or stake in the outcome. A version of you gets constructed in other people's minds, and that version starts costing money. The wealthy people who get studied consistently, and this shows up in research on high net worth individuals, it shows up in interviews, it shows up in observation across decades. These people have a quality that looks like pleasant vagueness around money. Ask them how an investment did, and they smile and ask how your grandkids are doing. Ask them what the house is worth, and they say they have no idea. The market is strange right now. This is not deception. It is a very deliberate form of protection. There is a version of your financial life that exists only inside other people's assumptions. That version can cost enormous amounts of money and energy if it becomes too detailed. The people who retire rich figured this out, and they keep that version strategically incomplete. The second habit is one that sounds almost insultingly simple, and yet the data on retirement savings in this country suggests that most people either do not know it or cannot hold on to it long enough for it to matter. The people who retire with real money consistently buy one level below the ceiling of what they can afford. Here is what that looks like in practice. A person gets a raise. Their income goes up meaningfully. The natural response, the response that advertising, social pressure, and basic human psychology all push toward, is to upgrade the life to match. Bigger house, newer car, better vacations. The feeling of having earned something. And technically, they have earned it. The problem is that the moment they upgrade the life to the ceiling of the new income, the ceiling becomes the floor. The lifestyle that was a reward becomes the baseline. And then the next raise gets absorbed the same way. And the next. And what should have been the engine of compounding wealth instead becomes a treadmill of escalating expenses that leaves the person arriving at retirement with an income history that looks impressive and a savings history that tells a completely different story. This is documented. It has a name. Lifestyle inflation. Lifestyle creep. The financial literature on it is extensive, and the pattern in the people who avoid it is remarkably consistent. At some point, they drew a line between what they earned and what they spent, and they refused to move that line every time the income went up. The gap between those two numbers was where everything got built. Not in the big moves, not in the dramatic decisions, in the consistent, quiet, boring refusal to let the lifestyle consume every dollar that came in. Robert, the man with the 9-year-old car, has driven vehicles like that his entire adult life. The cars got incrementally better over the decades, but they never reached the ceiling of what he could afford. The gap between what the car cost and what he could have spent stayed remarkably consistent for 40 years. Multiply that kind of discipline across every major spending category for 4 decades, and you get a number that surprises people. The third habit is the one that changes the texture of retirement more than almost anything else, and it is the one that shows up most consistently in the stories of people who enter retirement without financial anxiety. At some point, and the research suggests it needs to happen before the mid-50s to have maximum impact, though it is never too late, the people who retire well redirect a portion of their energy away from trading time for money and toward building something that produces income without requiring their active presence. This is not a complicated idea, but it gets presented in ways that make it sound either obvious or like something that only applies to people with large amounts of capital already in place. Neither is true. What this looks like in practice varies enormously. Real estate producing rental income. Dividend-producing investments that have been accumulating for years. A small business that was built slowly on the side of a primary career. In some cases, royalties or licensing from creative or intellectual work. The specific vehicle matters less than the underlying principle, which is this. Retirement means the time stops being traded for money. If the only income structure a person has built is one that requires their active participation, they arrive at retirement entirely dependent on savings, Social Security, and whatever the government has decided their working years were worth. But if alongside the primary income, there has been a parallel structure quietly producing cash flow for 10 or 15 or 20 years, retirement becomes a fundamentally different conversation. The research on retirement satisfaction consistently identifies this as one of the strongest predictors of financial security in later years. Not the size of the primary income, not even the total savings number, though that matters. The presence or absence of income that does not depend on the person's ongoing participation. The fourth habit is behavioral rather than financial, and it is one that has direct and measurable consequences for wealth preservation in ways that most people do not initially connect. The people who retire rich do not explain or defend their financial decisions to other people. This is harder to practice than it sounds. When someone makes choices that deviate from what the people around them consider normal, the car that does not get upgraded, the vacation that does not happen, the investment that looks conservative to outside eyes, social pressure arrives. Sometimes as direct questioning, sometimes as comments that carry a judgment inside them. And the natural human response is to want to explain, to want to make people understand that the choice is strategic rather than a sign of struggle, to want to correct the misimpression. The problem is that explanation opens negotiation, and what gets studied in the behavior of high net worth individuals around this issue is striking. The people who explain their financial choices to others consistently end up spending money they did not intend to spend as a result of that explanation. The explanation establishes that the person is operating inside a framework that can be engaged with. The person on the other side of that explanation can address it, can provide a counter, can find the version of the no that becomes a yes. The person who simply declines, warmly, without friction, without a reason attached, closes the loop. There is no opening. There is no framework to engage with. The people who retire well have an extraordinary capacity for what might be called graceful deflection. They hear a comment about a choice they have made, and they let it land without responding to it. A shrug, a smile, a change of subject. They have made a private decision about what matters to them, and they have chosen, quite deliberately, not to submit that decision to external review. The fifth habit is the shortest to describe and among the most powerful in practice. These people say no without attaching a reason to it. The no is clear, it is warm, it is final, and it arrives without explanation. Because explanation, as described above, invites negotiation, and every financial decision that begins as a no and ends as a yes through negotiation represents a failure of the boundary. The pattern in people who retire with wealth is consistent here. They learned at some point, some earlier than others, most through at least one expensive lesson, that a clean no with no reason attached ends the conversation immediately. The people in their lives who respond to that clean no with grace and acceptance are the people worth keeping close. The people who push back against it are providing important information about their intentions. This applies to investment opportunities, to requests for money or loans, to time commitments that would divert energy from income-producing activities, to purchases that someone else has decided you should want. The no without explanation is one of the most underrated financial tools available to anyone, and it costs nothing to use. The sixth habit is one that gets studied extensively in the behavioral economics literature and shows up with remarkable consistency in the profiles of people who accumulate wealth over long periods of time. They are genuinely indifferent to what the people around them are buying, not critical of it, not resistant to it, not white-knuckling through the desire to have what someone else has, actually indifferent. The neighbor's renovation does not register as information. The new car in the colleague's driveway does not produce a signal. The trip someone describes at a dinner does not activate a comparison. This sounds like it should be a personality trait, something some people have and others do not. But what the research on consumption behavior suggests is that it is largely a function of exposure management. The consumer economy runs on a mechanism called social proof, the tendency of human beings to interpret what other people around them are acquiring as a signal that those things are worth acquiring. This mechanism is ancient and was adaptive in environments where it made sense to follow the behavior of others. In a modern consumer economy, it is being exploited at enormous scale by people who are very good at understanding exactly how it works. The defense against it is not willpower at the point of purchase. By the time you are standing in front of something you want, the mechanism has already done most of its work. The effective defense, which is what the data on long-term wealth accumulators consistently shows, is upstream. It is reducing exposure to the information about what other people are buying in the first place. The people who retire rich are not fighting desire at the point of purchase. They have organized their information environment in a way that produces less desire to begin with. The seventh habit is the one that runs counter to almost everything the culture says about what success is supposed to feel like. And it is perhaps the most honest thing that can be said about what actually separates the people who retire comfortably from the ones who retire rich. The people who accumulate serious wealth by retirement continue to live as though they need to be careful, even after the number is large, even after any reasonable analysis would say they are fine. This is not anxiety. This is not pathological frugality. It is something that looks different from both of those things when you observe it closely. What it actually is that the habits that produced the wealth have become the person. They are no longer disciplines being consciously maintained. They are just how the person thinks. The internal check before a significant purchase is not a labor, it is automatic. The reflex toward preservation over consumption is not something being fought for in the moment. It has been practiced long enough that it simply operates without effort. What gets misunderstood about this habit in most financial content is the framing. The habits get presented as a means to an end. You do the hard thing long enough, you arrive at the number, and then the discipline is no longer required. The finish line has been crossed. But what the observation of people who actually accumulate serious wealth over time shows consistently is that the people who maintain wealth treat the habits not as means, but as identity. These habits are who they are. Abandoning them would not feel like freedom. It would feel like becoming someone else. Robert, with the 9-year-old car and the $2 million net worth, does not check the scratch on the bumper and feel nostalgic for a newer model. He does not walk past nicer cars and feel a pull. The habits are not a cage he is still inside of. They are just how he moves through the world. And the financial outcome of moving through the world that way for 40 years is sitting quietly in accounts that his neighbor knows nothing about. The pattern across all 7 of these habits is the same. None of them feel significant in the moment they are practiced. The car that stays 9 years instead of 4. The raise that gets saved instead of spent. The no that gets said without a reason. The financial detail that does not get shared. None of these feel like winning. They feel unremarkable. The remarkable thing is doing them long enough that they stop being choices and become character. Because once they are character, they do not require maintenance. They simply produce results, year after year, quietly, without drama, until the day arrives when someone leans over a fence and asks if everything is okay, and the answer is yes. Everything is fine. Everything has been fine for a long time.